you guys hear me okay? Okay. All right, hi, my name's Moroni Jessop, and I am a practicing Mormon fundamentalist. I'm not a historian, I'm not an academic. I rely completely on my own perception and experience as a frame of reference. So this is my story of how I personally encountered racism in Mormon fundamentalism as it pertains to the priesthood and temple ban, how it affected me personally, how this concept is now changing and evolving among polygamists. So this is my story. Even though I'm from a prominent fundamentalist family, the Jessops, my family was also actually raised in the LDS church, and I spent my first 20 years as a mainstream member of the church. However, my father had fundamentalist inclinations, and the lifting of the priesthood ban in 1978, allowing all worthy members to receive the priesthood and all worthy members to enter the temples regardless of race or skin color, was the proverbial shelf breaker for my dad. He never entered an LDS temple again post-1978. My dad believed implicitly in the teachings of Brigham Young in regard to race. I do want to point out that in spite of his views on the priesthood ban, my father taught us to avoid racism as much as possible. He never tolerated racial slurs in his home. Moreover, I grew up in a biracial home. My white father, who served a mission in Mexico, married an indigenous Mexican woman, my mother. Spanish was the principal language spoken in our home. Thus, this was an unusual for a 1970s Mormon home. At age 20, I was excommunicated from the LDS Church, along with my entire family, for believing in fundamentalist principles. My father encouraged me to move from our home in Arizona to Salt Lake City to be close to the independent fundamentalists. Growing up in Arizona, around mostly a Chicano culture, I had actually never really experienced racism firsthand until I moved to Utah. Although I met a lot of wonderful people with the independents, I also experienced a high level of racism, mostly directed at people of the black race, in levels I had never experienced before. I also experienced racism directed at me for being a Mexican, something I also had never experienced. One night, dejected, I called my mother in Arizona and said to her, "You're not gonna like it here." "Why?" she asked. "They don't like Mexicans," I replied. Shortly thereafter, my family and I joined the Apostolic United Brethren, a polygamous group also known as the Allred group. Their policy towards people of other races was less intense. They had a sizable colony in Mexico, and I met and married my wife Andrea in the AUB, also from a biracial family, half Japanese. However, the AUB, the Allred group, still maintained a tight restriction about black members joining, and I saw potential black converts turned away without even baptism. They were told to go back to the LDS Church. And I had no reason to question the priesthood ban. It was taught by the early Mormon leaders and the priesthood council of the AUB, so it must be true. Years later, my family and I wound up leaving the AUB and formed a united order in the Arizona desert. I got an email from a man who was in the AUB. He had taken a Polynesian wife from New Zealand, and when he went to the AUB leadership requesting a sealing, he was denied because of the race of his wife. You see, the AUB teaches that the Polynesian races also fall under the curse of Cain, as they call it. I went to my father, my priesthood head, and asked him what I should do. "You had better leave this one alone, son," he told me. After all, who are we to question what other fundamentalist leaders had taught? So I wrote this guy back, and I literally told him, "I'm sorry, you have no place among us." My dad passed away, and this man persisted and kept on writing me. He said something that finally resonated with me. "All I wanted from the AUB was righteous judgment, and they would not give it to me," he wrote to me. "Where do I go for judgment?" So I took it upon myself to judge the situation, and I invited him out to Arizona. They came out for one of our conferences, and when they got there in their car, I took one look at her, and I felt an immediate love for her, and wondered why I had even felt like there was a problem. Others in our community had the exact opposite reaction. They took one look at this woman and her children and saw Canaanite. While we deliberated, this family moved to Arizona and started attending meetings with us. It took 3 long, unnecessary years. I researched church history and found that the priesthood had been given to the islanders from the days of Brigham Young and even Joseph Smith. I even went to New Zealand with his family. I got family records from the marae of the Maori, testimonies from the Hamilton Temple, and I even visited an anthropological museum in Auckland. I took all my findings, made a big packet, along with the church records, and presented my packet to the findings of our priesthood council, and they turned a blind eye to it. They rejected it. So then my father-in-law got the idea to do a DNA test on one of the daughters of this woman, and the DNA test showed no sub-Saharan African markers. The result was met with skepticism by most of the community. This did not stop the Polynesian daughter from marrying one of the young men in the community, the sealing performed by my father-in-law. The backlash was immediate and startling. Our chapel had an attic room where we met every Sunday morning quite early for the true order of prayer. One morning we arrived to find that our keys would not unlock the door to the prayer room. The locks had been changed without our knowledge. That's how we found out we had been excommunicated. There was no trial, no letter, nothing, just cut off. I had taught youth Sunday school for many years. My wife had been primary president for the community for 10 years. We weren't informed, we were just released, and other people were called to replace us. This schism sliced our community neatly in half between those who accepted the Polynesians and those who did not. I had family members on both sides. We built another chapel and started over on our own. A decade later, a leader in our new community suggested that we do DNA tests on ourselves. So I submitted my family to ancestry tests. That summer, I took my kids on a vacation to Utah, and on the way back, we stopped by Rockland Ranch, the polygamist community near Moab, where the homes are blasted out of the red rocks. We stayed with friends for the night, and our bedroom was at the back of the cave. The room was utterly black and still, like a sensory deprivation tank. And that night, I had a spiritual experience that I feel helped me to prepare for what was to come. If I had more time, I would share the experience, but it helped me to process what happened next. The next morning, we drove back to Arizona, and when we arrived, that leader was waiting on the driveway with a paper in his hand. My DNA test results. I suppose that I don't need to say that my results showed what was not on the Polynesian girl's result: a healthy dose of African DNA. I was in violation now of the one-drop rule. Now, I don't suppose for an instant that a small percentage of African DNA makes me black, but for most Mormon fundamentalists, it was enough. I fought it at first. I tossed and turned that night. My whole life felt like a lie. After a few days, I started to remember instances in my life where I had seen evidence of the priesthood. Some in my family said, "I know the DNA tests are wrong because I know I hold the priesthood." My attitude was, I know I hold the priesthood even if the DNA tests are right. We called a meeting in our community with all the endowed members to discuss the issue of my questionable lineage. We decided as a community that I would not be restricted in my priesthood calling until we knew more. This did not settle well with some. My wife walked in on the Sunday school teacher telling my children if they lived righteously, maybe in the next life they would be eligible to hold the priesthood. And I have to say, we didn't even share our children what was going on yet, but the Sunday school teacher took it upon themselves to inform them. So we pulled our children out and never returned. No one asked us to leave or kicked us out, but I would not remain anywhere where my children would be considered lesser. We have been independent and alone ever since. I am grateful for this experience because it has taught me something that I had never had to consider before, that the priesthood temple ban is not a thing, and it never should have been. It was a knee-jerk reaction by Brigham Young to Orson Pratt opposing him on the topic of slavery in the 1852 legislative session. I know that all things in Mormonism are established by the mouth of two or more witnesses, yet in 1879, we continued the restriction based on the testimony of Zebedee Coltrane, and his testimony was contradictory and hearsay. I learned that even though Joseph Smith made several problematic statements on race, he never preached that black men couldn't hold the priesthood. Even the scriptures that he produced that we think say that don't really say that. Joseph Smith knew and sanctioned the ordination of black men like Walker Lewis and Elijah Abel. Joseph Smith commissioned a mixed-race woman, Elizabeth Allred, to make the first pair of garments and later sealed her to her husband in the red brick store. No, race should have never been an issue, and I am ashamed how we have treated our black brothers and sisters. How different things could have been. I would have never come to this understanding without a little piece of paper, a DNA test. I am grateful for this understanding, yet the result is I have kept my distance from other fundamentalist groups because I don't know how they will react to me. I have been nervous about this presentation because now the proverbial cat is out of the bag. Fundamentalists have long clung to this teaching because they value the words of those who went before. Brigham Young, John Taylor. If Brother Ruland said it was so, then it must be so. Now the LDS Church might pat themselves on the back for finally ending the ban in 1978, yet I would argue that they made this change for political expediency only. They have yet to address this topic head on and have only swept it under the proverbial carpet along with other verboten topics. Most fundamentalists will never reject the priesthood temple ban as I have, but with some communities, things are already changing. In 2022, one polygamous community in Missouri I know of has held its own test case on the black issue, and the result was a young family accepting a black woman as a plural wife. This mixed race sealing has stirred the waters for sure, but perhaps it will change the face of Mormon fundamentalism in ways that we cannot imagine. Hugh Nibley once said that if we believe the same thing 5 years from now that we currently believe, we have made no progress. 5 years ago, the possibility of blacks holding the priesthood was unimaginable to me. Imagine what Mormon fundamentalists might believe 5 years from now. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now open it for questions. Anyone who has a question, just step up to the audience mic.
Hi, thank you for your presentations. I just saw last Monday the movie, his name is Green Flake. Are you familiar with that? So it's about a black Mormon slave who was so important in the movement from Nauvoo to Winter Quarters and on into Salt Lake, and learned a lot of history. One thing that movie portrayed was that Brigham Young was so concerned about the political climate of Mormons being seen as anti-slavery, that's not how that should sound, but being against slavery, being abolitionists, that he promoted the idea of the ban on blacks just to keep Mormons safe. And I'd never considered that as a motivation. As I've read Brigham Young's words, Journals of Discourses, I think the man was a racist. As a matter of fact, my own faith transition began the day I read the LDS essay on blacks in the priesthood, in disavowing that all the things I'd been taught all my life. So I would just like your thoughts on the idea that this began as a politically motivated way to keep the church solvent, to keep the pro-slavery people from destroying the church, or were they really deeply racist? Thanks.
Well, I'll just mention that the first talk that Brigham Young gave in regard to restricting the blacks from the priesthood came during the 1852 territorial legislative session, where he and Orson Pratt were clashing on whether they should allow slavery in Utah or not. And part of me wonders if it was a knee-jerk, because he and Orson Pratt had clashed on other topics before. So part of me wonders, was this a knee-jerk reaction to Orson Pratt? But it's evident that he did have racist tendencies, like you indicate. I mean, after post 1852, it's replete with restricting. And did you have anything more you wanted to add on that?
I was just going to say that I think it's both. I think it can be both. I think that Brigham Young can do things that are politically expedient, but also deeply hold to them. It is, and we know that Joseph Smith ran on an abolitionist ticket when he ran for president. I like to believe he might have won, but I know that's not historically accurate at all. He wouldn't have. We know that he ran an abolitionist ticket, and we know that he ordained black men to the priesthood. So, and we do know that the fight over the territories was a difficult fight in terms of not only creating statehood, but a Utah territory and the nation of Deseret were all struggles. And it is true that there was contestation over the slave ownership issue, but I think that it has to be both in terms of Brigham Young, especially because we do know that there were other options through the life of Orson Pratt. Also, Greenflake is buried in a cemetery behind a meeting house. He's not in the Salt Lake Cemetery, and it's definitely worth going to visit him.
Connell O'Donovan has done a lot of research on early black priesthood holders in the LDS Church, and I'm just wondering if fundamentalists, Elijah Abel's probably the most famous, but there's Black Pete, Warner McCary, guy in Boston, Walker Lewis, his son, also by the name of Lewis. Have fundamentalists looked at especially between 1830, when Black Pete was likely ordained, and Elijah Abel, 1852 at that time period, to look at those black men who held the priesthood?
So yes, fundamentalists know history very well, and when I've talked to, Shirley's laughing at me. So yeah, yes, they do know the history. So I've asked multiple people about specifically Elijah Abel, just because Elijah Abel is the most known case. And when the answers I have received for people who know the case, it usually ends up being a situation of that he was ordained by Joseph Smith, but the ordination was not ratified in heaven. So that's usually how I've heard it be kind of looked back upon to explain why the priesthood ban still likely existed under Joseph Smith, because it existed in eternity, whether or not it was being upheld on earth.
And yeah, I want to reemphasize that also, that generally in my studies, I hear the same stories I've always heard, that there's a tale that Joseph went to Elijah Abel with tears in his eyes and told him that he made a mistake in ordaining him to the priesthood and that he didn't hold the priesthood. Yet there's no documentation of any of this. All we have are anecdotes. Nothing in writing, nothing that's documented, and they're just, it's a spume of tales that have sprung up to justify the priesthood ban.
Great, interesting presentations. Thank you very much. And you've got my head just spinning with your stories and your perspective and what's going on in our world today, where you would think that maybe outside of Mormon fundamentalism and some other aspects that racism had been kind of tamped down, but we're seeing a rise of that. And popular media personalities are presenting subtle racism that are very popular. And I don't know, I'm very concerned about this. And I know this is an unfair question, and it's kind of tangentially related, but I guess, I don't know, what can we do to fight against this rise of racism that is happening in our country now? And in fundamentalist communities, I mean, you've talked about that, how to address that, or how to try to, but it's hard. I don't know if you have any thoughts.
Well, I don't really have the solution on that. I've been gun shy, like I said, even doing this presentation, and I have kept myself aloof from other groups. I have some friends that are kind of like mind in different groups, and but I'm afraid to move to any community because I'm not sure how I'm going to be taken, how I'm going to be accepted, how my children are going to be accepted, who my children are going to marry, because this issue is going to come up. And then I had one friend say, well, you have me. I said, yeah, but that's not enough, I talked about this community in Missouri that started, they organized a test case, a committee, so to speak, and my best friend was on the committee. And what they did is that they decided to examine this topic from every level, and they didn't come to quite a consensus, but the amount of people who were kind of like-minded with me, the number of people was surprising to me. It was startling. So I think that fundamentalists are going to have to confront these issues, and they're either going to dig their heels in or they're going to start changing things, But as far as solutions, I'm just kind of winging it. I'm going along with the flow.
So I mean, I got interested in this history because I realized that Mormon fundamentalism is generally looked at as the polygamists, right? The polygamists and the fundamentalists are often synonymous without realizing that Mormon fundamentalists believe a lot of things that the LDS Church doesn't believe, and we don't talk about them. And I noticed that fundamentalists don't talk about the priesthood ban. I mean, maybe you'll hear someone talk about it, but it's not talked about in any substantial way, and I would even argue it's avoided because it's not, a popular opinion to hold. And so I got interested in that and kind of framing it within the fundamentalist movement generally was a reaction. It was born out of a reaction to the end of polygamy. And many of their positions were, and I know my fundamentalist friends won't love this, but my argument is that many of their positions were a reaction to things not only the LDS Church was doing, but societally. And I think looking at the history of the 1930s and 40s and 50s is something that we can do. Brigham Young, existed, but other people existed after him. And why aren't their comments about the issue ever talked about? But I think the bigger one that, I'm not a fundamentalist, I'm not a Mormon, but I'm hoping that in a small way I can at least get people to talk about why they hold the beliefs they do. Because I think the first step to any kind of real change is to acknowledge that there's something to even talk about. And granted, not all fundamentalists are going to talk about it, and that's not my job. But I think Mormonism generally, Moroni mentioned the LDS Church, so they're not excluded from this too, but I think it's time to talk about the priesthood ban. And that's the small thing that I can participate in.
And that's the whole reason I decided to do this, was to generate discussion.
Thank you both. I'm interested to know if, similar to kind of the mainstream LDS Church, within fundamentalist groups, will it require, a revelation or kind of a top-down approach, or is there the capacity there for it to be from the bottom up and to motivate that change?
Well, in the story that I told about the the Polynesian people that came among us. There were some that, you know, were, and I distrusted these offers, but they were offering to give patriarchal blessings, you know, and I counseled this family to avoid that because to me it was evident that it was going to be self-revelatory, that the person that wanted to give the blessings already had it determined in their minds that these were a polluted people and was going to pronounce that upon their heads. And so I preferred to dig my answers up through church history and through precedent rather than relying on revelation and you know, and that was an important lesson to me, that one of my deepest belief tenets is that we should not use spiritual means to make large life-affecting decisions like that. You know, that you can't, as Joseph Smith taught, you can't condemn somebody based on spiritual evidence. And, you know, I don't know, it'll be interesting to see how things turn out. I'm watching this community in Missouri with particular interest to see which direction they go, because even though they had a ceiling, not everybody in that community agrees with it, you know. So we'll just have to see.
I mean, I think it would take a revelation. You know, the bigger question is, will that revelation ever happen? But also more than that, is a revelation even possible? And most fundamentalist communities that I know of would say that it's kind of a done deal, right? Rule and Allred said that it will not be until not until the millennium when all the sons of Abel receive the priesthood, then the ban can be lifted. And so there are fundamentalist communities who do believe that in the millennium, other people can receive the priesthood. So for communities that follow Rule and Allred, it would appear to be a case closed situation that, you know, God doesn't change his mind like he did in 1978. I mean, would I like to see that happen? Sure. But so I think the bigger question is a revelation possible in a lot of these communities, and in many of them, the unfortunate answer will be no.
Hi, Moroni.
Hi.
Serena again. You mentioned that you're cautious of backlash and further discrimination in rejoining another fundamentalist community. So that's part of the reason why you and your family are independent right now. So I was wondering if they're that just sounds like something that's really hard to cope with, existing on the margins. And being excluded from people and communities that you love. So I was wondering what the way forward is for you and your family. Do you envision something, or how are you building community and finding community in the places you are now? And if you're finding peace on your own and you're committed to that, or what is the way forward for you and your family? And if this is too personal, I totally understand.
No, that's a good question. So the simple answer is I don't know yet.
Okay.
You know, I have kind of, like you said, stood in the margins. I'm trying to figure out what to do. When we went to Missouri recently to visit the community there was a person that was present who was visiting also, who had been one of the people who had cut us off. And it was awkward. It was awkward because I realized then that no matter where I go, this topic is going to come up and this topic is going to be there. And, you know, I was less confrontational. I have an older brother who's kind of with me on this, who was more confrontational. And he told the guy, he said, what are you going to do when we're standing in the top floor of the temple across from each other? He says, are you going to be able to stand in the same room as me? You know. So I don't know. I'm very gun shy and cautious about really getting involved with other groups, and in some way I like it. I like being independent, but it is a lonely place. It's a very lonely place. Now, how my kids have affected this? My kids have seen me go through. I've been excommunicated 4 times in my life. I had one friend call me an excommunication whore. And one thing that I've learned as my kids are becoming adults, I'm the parent of 11 kids, most of them are grown, is that, you know, it wasn't just me along for this. My kids were along with this too. And all of these experiences have soured my kids to religion altogether. Most of them are not following in my path, and which is sad to me, but at the same time I understand why, because this was not just tough for me, it was tough for them. So we'll see what happens.
Thank you.
I just wanted to make a comment to the excommunication thing. You just validated something I just went through. My husband's divorcing me because I left the LDS church, and my kid and I go to Community of Christ now, and my kids are gonna be half LDS, half Community of Christ. And I had been thinking about resigning due to excommunication, and I was so worried about my parents who are all in, and all they do is genealogy, and how this was going to destroy them. But what you said just now about your kids is validating. I realized I'm so focused on my parents, I'm not thinking about my young children and what it'd be like for them growing up half LDS with an excommunicated mom for apostasy, for talking about Community of Christ. And so I chose to resign, not because I wanted to, but because I felt like it would be better for my children psychologically to have a mom who left on her own versus being excommunicated for talking about Community of Christ online, because heaven forbid, you know, LDS Church free. But anyway, I just wanted to thank you for validating that, and I'm really sorry that you and your family have had to go through what you've gone through.
Thank you, and I feel for your situation as well. So.
Thank you for sharing your experience and being vulnerable with us about that. My question is, you know, in as much as the perseverance or the doubling down on the priesthood and temple ban in fundamentalist communities is in largely kind of a reactionary response, and is, to me, it seems as also a reaction to this need to create social identity in response to the church, you know, changing its policy. And my question is, you know, we create our social identities through this tension between needs for belonging and needs to establish uniqueness within our communities. And inasmuch as the LDS Church maintains an antagonistic relationship with fundamentalist communities, then that need for uniqueness in that social identity remains very much in force. So is there anything, like, we know that it's arisen out of these needs? How do we address this problem if that original source of motivation for doubling down on these ideas is still in force?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that the fundamentalist movement exists because the LDS Church does, not only because most people who were fundamentalists in the 20s, 30s, 40s were all LDS before they suddenly were members of a priesthood council, but also modern LDS Church exists really in reaction to fundamentalism. Heber J. Grant was the president when the fundamentalist movement was born, and Heber J. Grant shaped his religious identity and the religious identity of his community. He organized around fundamentalists. If you look at most of the things that Heber J. Grant was doing, he was organizing around this movement that he hated. And he wrote letters to Joseph Musser that were just wild, especially when he called Heber J. Grant, my favorite account is Heber J. Grant called fundamentalist women silly, which, you know, that's great. So it is the case that both of them simultaneously organize around each other. And until both movements stop organizing around each other, there won't be a doubling down. The problem, I would say, is, you know, I think the LDS Church actually will have a harder time doing that. Most fundamentalists today, especially after 1978, have kind of, you know, there was this idea for a long time that the LDS Church was the mother church, and that the fundamentalist movement was just they were keeping the lights on. The fundamentalist movement was like the real priesthood. And I think in recent time especially, I think that's kind of gone by the wayside, and fundamentalists have largely stopped organizing around the LDS Church. But even in the last 10 years, the LDS Church has released comments saying there are no Mormon fundamentalists. That's on the church's website. And so they continue to organize around them in very real ways. But the other kind of thing that I say this a lot, and it's a hard thing, but the LDS Church creates fundamentalists every time they excommunicate men who read Truth magazine. It's a tale as old as time that, you give someone a set of Truth magazine and you're gonna make a fundamentalist, but you don't make them until you excommunicate them. And so I see that as really, when I look at what's the main source of Mormon fundamentalism, it's disciplinary councils in the LDS Church. So that's kind of how I see a possible end to the reaction, is stop organizing around each other, and the LDS Church makes more fundamentalists than the fundamentalist movement ever will.
And that is true. That I mentioned that my dad became a fundamentalist with the 1978 ban, and I know that that's true with my wife's father also. It seems like every time there's a batch of changes, whether it's changes in the temple ordinance, that we see the fundamentalists ranks swell with each change. And just this week, we went to go visit somebody from my old ward from when I was LDS, and he knew that I was a fundamentalist, and he immediately began asking a lot of questions, and then it became very clear that he was not happy with the direction that the church was taking right currently. And I told my wife afterwards that he's either going to become a fundamentalist or an ex-Mormon, one of the two. And over the last 5 years, me being involved with Sunstone and with Lindsay and the podcast, I've come to, in my discourse with a lot of people, I've come to the realization that ex-Mormons and fundamentalists asked the same questions when they were separating from the LDS Church. And it's just, we took one direction and ex-Mormons took a different one. I've even had a couple of ex-Mos tell me, if I had known about fundamentalism when I started asking these questions, I may have become a fundamentalist. So.
I just want to echo that you were mentioning that the comments about race and the priesthood were a moment on your shelf. And that's true, that two people can read the Polygamy Kirtland and Nauvoo essay, and one can say Joseph Smith was not a prophet, and the other can say, well, I need to take a plural wife. Those are the same. Those are two valid responses to the same exact document that was released. I would say the reality, and LDS people, now my LDS friends are going to be like, what the hell? I would say that becoming a polygamist from reading that essay is the more logical conclusion. Because it's more logical to hear, yeah, polygamy was real, than Joseph Smith was wrong, right? Staying in the LDS Church once you read those essays it's a lot more to wrap your head around, or going ex-Mormon than getting rid of everything. The logical conclusion of anti-Mormon literature is to join the movement that supports everything in that literature. It's hard medicine.
Well, Moroni, I want to thank you for sharing your story. I know that's a challenging thing to do, and just give you a big hug. And I wanted to say that in the 1990s, when I was in Colonia Industrial, or Osumba, Mexico, with that AUB branch that Margarita Bautista was involved with, I heard the most racist church sermons I'd ever heard in my life. And so a little different than you were saying, Christina, more recently, but certainly in the 1990s, this stuff was taught right over the pulpit. And in fact, it was the statements were made along the lines of, this is clear evidence that the LDS Church is in apostasy, is that their willingness to allow black members in. So at least at that time, it was very, very much in the open. I'm curious, Moroni, you said you were asked to take this DNA test. I wonder, were there others that were asked to take the test, and how broad is if you can speak to it without, with respecting people's confidentiality, how broad is the experience that you've had among, especially Mexican descended members of fundamentalist branches?
Well, The DNA test was done initially with, because our community had intermarried so much, it was actually done on one of my daughters, and then it was done on one of her cousins. And the cousin came up with 0 sub-Saharan African markers, but my daughters did. And then I had a brother that was really, really upset at the test, and so he went and he purchased kits from every single company that does it. And the percentages were different, but the marker was there in every single test. But, and it created a conundrum in our community because we had done DNA tests for the Polynesian family. So they couldn't, some of the people in our community based their testimony that Polynesians were okay, so to speak, because of the DNA tests, and they couldn't accept that set of tests and reject ours. It created too huge of a conundrum. And, and as far as, Sumba, yeah, I agree. I have family members that married into the Asumba family, some of the families in Asumba. And according to them, we're all Gentiles. They are the only true Israelites, these indigenous people in Mexico. They consider themselves 100% Israel, and the rest of us are Gentiles. But what I'm hearing, and I can't confirm this, but what I heard is that up in the AUB, that a lot of the Jessops were taking DNA tests and coming up with the same results. So there was an assumption that it came from my dark-skinned mother, but I'm not so sure. Ultimately it doesn't matter. But these were some of the discussions that were had then.
I just want to note something about Colonia Industrial. When I published this article, there is a inaccuracy, and I will take this time to say I was wrong about one of my arguments, because I don't speak Spanish. In that the first Mormon fundamentalist to start talking about the ban was Margarita Bautista in 1958. And he very intentionally started talking about the ban in 1958 as a way of saying we're Lamanites, we're not black. And so the priesthood ban was a way for Bautista to kind of center, to legitimize who he was, because there was a lot of contestation over his ordination into the priesthood council, especially among Charles Zitting, who was bothered that a Lamanite would be welcomed into the priesthood council. So he very much did use the priesthood ban as a way to be like, I'm a Lamanite, I'm not black. And that kind of legacy remains. In Ozumba, that racism is very centrally anti-black racism in Colonia Industrial.
And I want to echo that story. I spoke to Joe Thompson, who was the sound man at the meeting in Salt Lake when Joseph Musser brought Margarita Bautista. He wanted to introduce him to the congregation as a member of the council, and the way he did it was a roundabout way. He kept asking Bautista to get up and speak, and so he would get up and give a little sermon, and then he would sit down, and then he would call Bautista to speak again, and he did it like 3 times, and finally Bautista realized that Musser wanted him to announce his ordination, and the man that witnessed it told me that one man jumped up and proclaimed loudly to the whole congregation that he would not have a black Lamanite preside over him. So.
Well, thank you. Our time is up. If there's any other questions or